Well, good afternoon. I think we can start. I'm Mary Kay Shanley. I'm here on behalf of Humanities, Iowa, which is just down the street. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the obituary and give you some examples, and there's a few thoughts about creating your own obituary that are on the handout. But I'm happy to see that there are tables set up, because if you want to stay after the formal HI presentation, we can talk about how do you start this, and where do you go, and what do you do, and what do you need to know. You probably have questions, and I thank you for coming. I write out notes and speak from notes, and I have a lot of examples here today that we can talk about, but I decided that the first sentence should be, we are gathered here today together to talk about having the last word, which is really, truly what an obituary is. It is the last word, once and for all. An obituary is really what I think it should be. It's about who you are, or we are, who are we, and what have we accomplished, and what do we want others to take with them about us when we're gone. And those are the three things that really need to be in an obituary in order for you to read it and value it. And I've read obituaries about people in the Des Moines Register that I've never heard of, but they were so well written that it was it's like, oh, that person was interesting, or oh, that was well written, that kind of stuff that really moves you forward. So let me give you some information. An obituary is not your biography, okay? And it's not your autobiography. It's not a biography, nor your autobiography, nor is it a memoir. I teach memoir at the University of Iowa, and I've given this presentation, and some people say, well, is that what a memoir is? And I say, no. A memoir is about a thread in your life, or a moment in your life. Obituary is about your life. And a well-written obituary, and you're here because you want to have one, or you want to work on one, or you at least want to hear about one, about what a well-written obituary is, it really becomes worthy of your time and your consideration. It really does, okay? So I want to give you first an old-fashioned history lesson about the obituary. The obituary comes from the Latin word for obit, meaning death. And when these notices first came out, they were very brief announcements, and they were published in America as early as the 16th century, which I've found to be amazing. But it was not until the 19th century, and I think that this happened because this is what the British were already doing. Obits became more detailed accounts. At first it was just a notice of John Doe died on this date, or whatever. And they became more detailed accounts. And that's when, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, they began to appear with some regularity in the press. So it was like anything else. It was a little gem that kind of forms and flowers into something that's worthy. By the time of the Civil War, obituaries for soldiers were written almost all the time, and they were sentimental and religious, which is not surprising. And this is also at the same time when embalming found favor, because it meant that the body would arrive home intact. I did a lot of research, and I thought, well, I ought to share that just because now I know it. so that's when embalming became a focus. Then the next thing to happen was death journalism. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it was a trend toward the end of the 19th century, and obits in England and the U.S. focused more on the graphic and the odd then they did on the graphic in the odd pieces of the person's life and death, rather than, we're still not at that point to what we are used to today. So that continued into the 20th century. And the one example that I brought with me for you in this really kind of a morbid obituary was that President Theodore Roosevelt, died in 1909. And this is, his obituary was in the New York Times. And and it led with an elaborate, that meant that was the first thing in the obituary, with an elaborate description of the blood clot that, quote, detached itself from a vein and entered the lungs. So that's how the president's obituary was written. Okay? In the earliest 20th century, about that time, I'm going to ask if anybody's ever heard of this. There was, for a while, in my research, I found obits that were written in verse form. Have any of you? Okay, me neither. So this was a very long obituary, and it was all in verse form. But I'll just share the beginning of it with you. It was in 1917, and it was called A Tribute to Guy Swain. He was from Delaware, Ohio, and he fell to his death while trying to chase a raccoon from a tree one night. So his obituary begins, "A precious one is gone, a voice we loved is still, a place is vacant in our home, which never can be filled. Oh, Guy, it seemed so bad the way you had to go." Okay, so if you want to stay afterwards and switch to poetry, that's a pretty good opener. Pretty good opener. It was trendy for a while, but I'm not sure it's trendy anymore. But today you can do whatever you want. Another one I want to share with you. This came from Chris Rossi, who's the director of Humanities Iowa. He sent it to me because he knew I was going to do this program. And it's about it was in 1920 when the Robert F. Scott expedition to the South Pole happened, and nobody survived. And so the obituary was fairly long, and too long to share, but I'm going to give you some of the highlights of what happened. Because it is said today, ever since then, that their deaths became their obituary because nobody was there and they all died on the South Pole. So Captain Scott and the 4 companions that were still with him reached the South Pole on January 7th, 1912, and that was this was a disappointment, 1 month after the rival Norwegian party led by Roald Amundsen got to the South Pole. And I do remember learning that it's like you did all this work and you weren't the first one. Scott's party attempted to make it back to their supply base, but the journey was dogged by misfortune and all died. One from a concussion, one from frostbite. He walked out of the camp to his death with saying the words, "I may be some time." And what I'm assuming is that somebody else wrote that down or took that home, because they did they did have journals. And then the other 3 were caught in a blizzard and perished 11 miles away from the supply depot. One of the 3 was Bertie Bowers, and he assured his family that his death would be painless and that he would, quote, only sleep in the cold. Captain Scott, the man who led the expedition, his last diary entry recognizes that there is no hope of survival, concluding with a message to the nation, "For God's sake, look after our people." And eventually, their bodies were found and buried where they had died beneath the cairn, so that's where they remain. Now, this is a little bit more into our time. By the late 20th century, we began to see for the first time the common man obituary. And that was the common man obituary routinely recognized the people in this room. We are the regular folks, you know. We're not the Captain Scotts or the Theodore Roosevelts. And the common man obituary rose to prominence in the late 20th century, and now, of course, the obituary it's understood that anybody who wants an obituary in the paper and we'll talk about how you do that, but anybody who wants that can have it, and that's how it became commonplace that people our age think about the obituary, because if you want to have input into your obituary, this might be the time to do it. So when in the obituaries in the common man era, late 20th century, first it included three things. First was the notice of death, okay? Second was an account of a person's life, and third was information about the upcoming funeral. And what differentiates that kind of obituary from what we are going to talk about more today is that the account of the person's life was very factual. Was born here and grew up here, and maybe where you went to college or where you live now, where you used to live, where you live now, who your family who your family members were, and what you died of, and maybe it would probably with the funeral home say, you know, donations can be made or memorials can be made, but it was really still factual. But it was the first time that all of us had our really had our turn at having an obituary that was well written. Then the process back then, at the late 20th century, was that the family members submitted the information to the funeral home, and then that information was, they filled it all out, all of what they wanted in, and then it was sent to from the funeral home to the newspaper, or newspapers if you wanted it in more than one. And that's where it was written up by usually a cub reporter. And if you don't know what that means, it's somebody who's brand new. And I'll give you my example, my experience. When I was graduated in journalism, I was hired by the Des Moines Register back in the day when it was a real newspaper. and so the guys that were hired when I was hired all wrote the obituaries and the weather and the police blotter stuff for 1 year. If you lasted a year, then the Register was interested in you. And women couldn't write the obituary. We were. Oh, and then I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. It was almost always written by a cub reporter, and then it was read by a professional copy reader. And in those days, everything was read by a professional copy reader. And I have to tell you that today nothing is. And that's the truth. And it was proof for accuracy. And then it went, then once we sent it down the way, it went to the layout, and then from there to the press room. And I was a female young hire, and I wasn't allowed to write obituaries or do police blotter work, because that was a man's job. So for women, we wrote for 1 year weddings, engagements, and club news. And if I've always thought that if you could do that for a year, you deserve to be in a newsroom. So that's true. So so now today it's all different, and here's why. As I did all this reading and researching, it is because of social media. And there's a penchant, and you all know this, there's a penchant within social media to put everything on the table. And probably people our age are a little more judicial about what we're going to share with the public, but probably more than young people. But we have now what they call the personalized obituary. Again, and now it is written by a family member, or it can be written by a friend, or even the deceased ahead of time. And the one person whose name you might remember is Joy Corning, who was one of Terry Branstad's. She worked with him in his first administration, and Joy Corning died within the last year, and she wrote her own obituary. It was very short, because she was very accomplished. She didn't even mention that she'd been the lieutenant governor. She didn't mention all of the things that she had done. She chose to, it was just a very plain obituary, but that's how she chose to do it. So, but the personalized obituary today includes the factual information that Joy Corning used, but it also includes, and this is where I think we get to shine, it also includes the insight into the life of the person who is deceased. That's important, because that's the biggest change now, is that it's who you were and all of this factual information, but it also gives us an opportunity to tell our story a little bit, okay? That's different than it used to be. One other thing that's also different is that the obituary, when you fill it out through the funeral home, or when you write it and give it to the funeral home, they take it directly to the newspaper's advertising department. Nobody there is going to proof it, and it goes from the advertising department into layout and design, so that they know how they have to look at how much space this is going to take up. There is no proofing because there are no longer proofreaders, and so no corrections are made. So if you're going to give to a funeral home or your information, make sure it's correct, because there are no more proofreaders. The newspaper business has changed so much that it's just, that's the way it is. So be meticulous if you're going to write your own obituary. When we began writing our own obituaries, the first 6 or 8 lines were free, which just gives you about enough time to tell them who you were and that you died and where you were buried, when you're going to be buried. That's about all it was. And then after that, X number of dollars were charged for what you wrote. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because this is really important. If you are paying today, I don't know if there's anything free. The cost per word and the cost per size of a photo you want to run is something you need to know before you give it to the newspaper, because it can be very expensive. Okay, in fact, I have friends that are still in the newsroom, whatever's left of it, in the register, and one of them told me that the obituary is a source of income now, a big source of income. All right, so you can get the basic death notice in the local paper, because that's a requirement that the local paper puts in a basic death notice. But if you want to have anything else in it, you're going to pay for it, okay? And I think probably it's well worth the money. So let me give you a few examples. Are any of you familiar with the website legacy.com? Okay. I went to legacy.com just to see what they do. And on this one day that I went, they had these 5 like short stories on their website. It's pretty broad based. The first one was remembering Andrew Wyeth on his 100th birthday. The second was about a South African musician named Ray Fury, who was featured on Paul Simon's Graceland album. The third one was where you could sign up for obituaries via email, and I assume that that would be examples. The fourth one is how to prepare for burial in the Muslim tradition, and what it requires. Same-sex family members wash the body an odd number of times before covering it with a shroud. Legacy.com is apparently really a source of a lot of information. And then the last piece on its website every day is advice and support. And this day it was Ask Pete. What if the in-laws object to me dating after the death of my wife? Okay, so, well, you know, that's what they say. With social media, everything's out on the table. Okay, here's some more examples. For a while, multimedia tributes, I'm not sure they're still on anymore, but it was a video obit that would be, site that would be posted by the New York Times. And it included, the one I picked out to tell you about, included an appearance, because it's video obits, by the newly deceased subject himself, Art Buchwald, whom I'm sure you've all heard of. And in the first frame of his video obituary, he addresses his viewers with a giant grin and says, "Hi, I'm Art Buchwald, and I just died." Okay. Also, because of social media, there's another website now called Obit Kit, a guide to celebrating your life, and it's by Susan Soper. If you want any of this afterwards, I will give it to you. And Susan Soper, this is her site, and she said, quote, "We are more open and apt to have a sense of humor than denial about death. People want to celebrate someone for who they are, not some cookie-cutter person." And to me, that is the gist of what the personal obit is that we get to be we. Brief examples. This is just pulled from different obituaries. Wayne Brocky was a retired wood plant manager in Klamath Falls, Oregon. His obit was written by his grandson and comments on Mr. Brocky's penchant for ordering gadgets and clothing touted by TV pitchmen on the QVC cable shopping network. Quote, in the obit, "QVC lost a loyal customer on September 28th, 2016. See, there really are no parameters anymore. Okay. I had fun doing this. Alan Lee Franklin, who died in a motorcycle accident in Virginia. His obituary was written by his brother and included this, quote, "His family constantly warned him about the dangers of riding motorcycles, but he was incredibly stubborn. Alan was a wonderful young man, and he was loved by everyone he met, despite his incessant need to argue with anyone about anything. He was probably the biggest tightwad in the mid-Atlantic region." Can't you just see these people? Here's another one. And this was in the Des Moines Register. I didn't write down why, but he must have lived there for a while in central Iowa. Dan A. Wilson of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, who died in June 2017, had written his obituary in first person. It was a long one. If you put it all in one column, it was probably about that long. And I picked out some of the really key sentences. "I crammed a 4-year education into 7 years. Morningside College is a Methodist school where I was forced to go to the chapel every week, take one religious course every semester for 2 years. The religion nearly turned me into an atheist." Another line from his. "In the late 80s and the early 90s, we were transferred to Houston, Texas, where I became part of the Enron fiasco. And finally, there will be no interment service since I'm going to be cremated. If you want to see me, you have to come by the house where Donna will have me displayed somewhere. Okay, so you get to do what you want. Kimberly Johnson of Morrisville, North Carolina, wrote this in her father-in-law's obituary. She said, along with his accomplishments, she recorded that he could be, quote, raunchy and charmingly vulgar. He enjoyed his boxed wine from a jelly jar, and during meals with polite company, he liked to liven up things by discussing the art of castrating roosters. Okay. Noah Sagan, 27, of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, died of a drug overdose. His mother wrote the obituary, and she determined to pay tribute in the obituary to her son's sarcastic humor, so she included this. He loved the Pittsburgh Penguins, playing video games, our dog Lizzie, and chickens. He hated lifting weights, but he did it anyway, and then he had a cigarette. Can't you just feel these people? A couple more. David Schlang of Scottsdale, Arizona, was lauded for his generosity and athleticism, but also he was a bit of a pack rat, so this is what whomever wrote his obit included. He left behind a legacy, including a lot of stuff that his wife and daughters have no idea what to do with. So, if you're in the market for golf clubs, golf balls, general sporting equipment, random electronics, CDs, cassettes, and LPs, you should wait an appropriate amount of time and then get in touch with us. When Rebecca Eggers of Bemidji, Minnesota died, her daughter wrote 2 obituaries. One was serious and traditional. The other said her mother seldom got up early enough to attend her Episcopal church, and she was never quiet about her dislike for kitchens and cooking. Plus, she learned to smoke in college and acquired a record number of demerits. Both of the versions she wrote, one was serious and one was traditional, were published in the Bemidji newspaper, but the only one she sent to Jackson, Tennessee, where her mother had grown up, was the straight obituary, because she didn't think they'd approve of her sense of humor. So that's thinking ahead. And about 2 years ago, Michael Gartner, I don't know if you know who he is. Okay, he lives in Des Moines. He's an owner of the Iowa Cubs. He was a front page editor of the New York Times for a long time. He's really an accomplished man. A few years ago, Michael Gartner wrote the obituary for his friend and colleague Bill Maurer, and if you lived in Des Moines, you would have known Bill Maurer. He was a newsman. And this is the opening sentence for Bill Maurer's obituary. This is what Michael Gartner wrote. Bill Maurer planned to live to be 100 years old. He didn't make it. Okay, two others. In May of this year, in the Redwood Falls, I just saw this last week. Somebody sent it to me. If they know you're speaking about obituaries and you get really odd ones, you want to look at it. So my friend Carol gave me this one to look at. It was a paid obituary that detailed the deceased woman's affair and accused her of abandoning her children. Readers felt it was in bad taste, so after one day in the paper, in the Gazette up there, it was pulled, but here's what it was. Kathleen Demlow Shunk was born on March 19th, 1938, to Joseph and Gertrude Shunk of Wabasso. She married Dennis Demlow at St. Anne's in Wabasso. We don't know where that was. It wasn't in the obituary. In 1957, and she had 2 children, Gina and Jay. In 1962, She became pregnant by her husband's brother, Demlo, and moved to California. She abandoned her children, Gina and Jay, who were then raised by her parents in Clemens, and Mr. and Mrs. Shrunk. She passed away on May 31st, not very long ago, 2018, in Springfield. We don't know where Springfield is. And she will now face judgment. She will not be missed by Gina and Jay, and they understand that this world is a better place without her. So I'm going to end on a really good example. That is not the end. A really good example of what an obituary should be about. And this one was very long. It was almost a half page in the Register for a couple of days. And my friend Robin Klein wrote it about her mother. Robin is very successful. She was she's a dietitian, and she was the official dietitian for National Pork Producers for years and years. And she's a professional writer who sends things out to magazines and things. And when her mother died, she just this year, her mother was 95 years old, and Robin wrote the obituary for her mother. And I don't have the time to share it all with you, but I pulled out some of the gems that are in her obituary, because I think when you hear this, you will know Robin Klein's mother. And that's one of the things that's so important in the personal obituary, is that the reader, if it's well written, the reader who may not have known the deceased would have a sense of the worth of that person, okay? So here's what I took from Robin Klein's mother's obituary, which was very long. Irene, that's her mother, grew up on a diversified family dairy farm, baking pies for threshing crews, gathering eggs from the hen house, and every autumn helping butcher and process hogs and making gallons of apple butter for the family table. In college, she became skilled in the campus bakery and fondly remembered making donuts for students' breakfasts in the wee hours of the morning. When she and her husband moved to Chicago, she enjoyed discovering the adventures of the metropolis, especially the many different ethnic neighborhoods and restaurants that offered new flavors and dishes and cuisine. Later, she led a team of food teachers, introduced international food classes to students, and broke with tradition by teaching boys food preparation classes. It was a very long piece, but it was interesting. I probably would have read it if I didn't know Robin, if I'd started to read it, just because it's so full of information. It's all you needed to know about her mother, especially if you were a friend of the family or a member of the family. But you learn from an obituary that is written like this, you learn not only who the person was, but what that person was. And that's the kind of obituary that I'm betting most of you are wanting to write. And you could put humor in it too. And some of the others were also pretty good. I just pulled out the funny stuff. Okay, so finally, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. This is the last thing. This is interesting, and you may not be up on this because you don't live in central Iowa. In 2017, Ethan Sergei Neubauer of Des Moines took his life after struggling. This is about him, and it's about the obituary. Ethan Sergei Neubauer of Des Moines took his life after struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and survivor's guilt related to a very tumultuous childhood he had in Russia. He was adopted by his Des Moines parents, and they raised him. And he brought with him from Russia as a young boy all of the mental illness and all of the challenges that presents, that we know that the state doesn't necessarily address today. And she, when he died, she wrote his obituary, and it was very well written about Sergei and about the family. But it ended, and I wish I have it at home, it ended with her making a plea to the lawmakers in Iowa at the General Assembly to address the inadequacy in funding Iowa's mental health crisis. And from that, and she's never been a public person, she has become a public person. She is one of the voices at the state capitol this last session for fully funding mental health programs in this state. She's recognized by people when she walks down the street now, and I've never met her, but I know that that's not what she was looking for. But she has found her voice and become a spokesperson for that. So I like to end with that, because sometimes people like that can truly make a change. Okay, guidelines. We'll go over some guidelines for writing an obituary, and then we're going to take Q&A and hear from you. First and foremost, the obituary, in order to do one of its jobs, is to contain important facts, you know this, about the person from birth to death. And a template for all of that information, I think, is always handled by the funeral home. And I talked to the person who's, I can't remember her title, but she was one of my writing students about 20 years ago. And now she's head of the Iowa Funeral Home Association. And I called her and said, what is it that has to be in this? And she said, every funeral home has that kind of information, and if you want to have the funeral home write it, you can, but if you want to make it personalized, they'll give you all that, what you need to put in the obituary, and then you can augment and give it back. So, she's okay. The funeral home handles the arrangements, and they give out the chronology of the person that is dying, that has died, and the scaffolding from that person's birth to death. So you have to think, if this is what you want, you have to think about it from birth to death. But there are many people, and that's what I've been talking about, that want to show the essence of the person. So think about this. You want to show the person's habits, their penchants. Tell me if I'm going too fast. This is just off my thinking. The awards they've won, the mountains they've climbed, the deeds and the stories shared. And if you want to put in some of the negative, if you think that's appropriate, because we all have negative, that's up to you. But I want you to consider this, and I think this is on the handout. Consider what messages you want to gift to the readers, because the obit you write, or the obit that you write for someone else, for whomever, for the deceased, becomes a gift to the people who are not only related to the person who died, but are also a gift to the people who knew the person who died, who are friends of that person, okay? Consider what people will think about the deceased. That's important. And consider what sense of person you want to preserve, because truly the obit is the last word. Finally, the obituary is, as I just said, essentially the last word. And this is me now standing on my little pulpit. First of all, because I'm a journalist, and cause of death, well, when we were in the newsroom, and there were, until very recently, cause of death, if that wasn't shared in the obituary, the Register and other major newspapers would not print it, because this is supposed to be factual. So I encourage you to include cause of death. And I think we're loosening up, because there have been some suicides lately in the Register where it's right up at the top, died as a result of, died of suicide or took his own life. There used to be such, even not very long ago, such a stigma about anybody who took their own life that you just said they died. But that's part of the family history. Are any of you here genealogists? Okay, I just gave this talk to a genealogy society of Central Iowa, and they knew more than I did. I mean, they really are into this. So think about that the cause of death really should be listed. When there's no cause of death listed, that person's history and the history of the family of that person is missing. Some of that history is missing. And so if you want to pass on your history to your family, you really need to do that. And here's the argument. I take it a little bit further with this example. In 1997, there was an obituary for a man named Orville Marlowe, and he lived in Perry and Boone, and his daughter is one of my very good friends. And in that, back in the 97, his death was listed as complications of Parkinson's disease. In fact, the funeral director at Perry, his wife had been passionate. The funeral director's wife was passionate that Orville include that. But he died. What he died from. Orville had owned a gas station in Perry, and later he worked for an oil company. And the funeral director's wife said she wondered about a link between Parkinson's and his job, saying that such informations in obituaries might be useful for research purposes. Okay? So when Mr. Crowley was diagnosed with Parkinson's, his children asked this was not in the obituary, his children asked the neurologist about hereditary factors with Parkinson's. The doctor said at the time in 97 that wasn't likely, that there was any connection. Later, the family learned that Mr. Crowley was likely part of a cluster, as 4 other cousins had died of the same disease. And much later, just maybe 18 months ago, his son-in-law found an obituary for Orville's half-brother, whom the family had never known existed, and he too died of Parkinson's. And here's the value of putting in an obituary cause of death. That is one way it's one way to preserve what happened to your family, but that is one way to track things like this. And this is stuff that research is made of. So it's a perfect example. So now I would like to know what you would like to talk about, and we can do some writing if you wish. You tell me. The rest of this is open for you. What would you like to do? Anybody? Or is this it? Do you have questions? Yes. Well, I'm a journalist, and I'm with you. If you were married to spouse A and spouse A divorced or spouse A died, I think it should be in, because this is part of the history of the family, and then you go on to the next person. I think you put it in. You don't have to give morbid details, but I think you have to give information, because a lot of what we rely on as we pass this on down in our families is in the obituary. The obituary is probably a lot more important than we think. And it never occurred to me as a Humanities Iowa speaker that I would be talking about the obituary. But the head librarian in the Ankeny system called me about a year ago and said, we have people here, a writing group, who wants to learn more about obituaries and writing obituaries, and would you come and talk to us? And I thought, okay, I can, I guess. And I went, I put together a program and a little workshop, and that's one of the most popular Humanities Iowa presentations that is requested. And it's because of people who want to trace family history. And if I'd had time and thought about it, I would have suggested that if you have a genealogy, if you're into genealogy, that this should have been, I should have said that to Michelle, that you could invite if there's a genealogy society here, they might have liked to come. And so I won't do that. I won't miss that again. Yes. That's right. If you don't put it all in an obituary, especially if you're not into genealogy, it dies. The facts fall right off the edge of a cliff, and they're just gone. And it doesn't take but a couple of generations for that to happen. She's seen Press Citizens obituaries where it says, a person chose to end their life, which is, everybody knows what that is, and I'm going to write that down. And it's a lot smoother and less abrasive than the word suicide. Yeah, okay. That's right. And we can't require people to put that in because they're paying for it. And I said back in the day, in the 60s, if you didn't have cause of death in, and then they did just flat out call it suicide. If you didn't have cause of death in, you didn't, your obituary, they just wouldn't run it, because it was like a news story with one of the components not in it. And good journalism calls for all the components. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And that means it's like research. It's fodder for research if you're going to track stuff. It's fodder for understanding your family line health-wise. It really is. Yes. I think that's a very good question. I think that you'll still have full control at the funeral home. It won't be in the paper. Do you know what some of these obituaries cost? $2,000. Yeah, the one that my friend Robin's, it was in half a page, 2 or 3 days with a big picture. $2,000. Yeah, that I should have said that when I was talking earlier. When you are going to put it in, if you're going to put it in a paper, find out how much it's going to cost per word, per day, before you submit it. Because when I said, I guess that was an understatement, when I said this has become a money raiser for newspapers, that it is. It's a money raiser right now. And you can't blame the newspaper. You can't blame the newspaper, because the newspaper is struggling to survive. I hope that it does, because that's my lifeblood. But it just has to be done that way. It just has to be done that way. Yes, I think that you can write whatever you want at the funeral home, and it won't be. A lot of people won't see it. The notice of death will always be in the paper, because that's legally required. So, and let me say this before I forget, because I do. Some people will do, if you go to the funeral, usually it's got the obituary in it. But if you don't have it on the, if you don't have it running in the paper and just the death notice, you can take what you wrote in the, for the funeral home and put it in the handout, so they still get it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I told her I was sick. Well, she should have listened. that I've never thought about this. Mm-hmm. And that brings up another point, which is a lot. I don't know a lot. I mean, I have to be very careful because I don't have any facts on this, but it seems that more and more people are opting not to be buried, or even well, if they're cremated, they maybe don't even want to be in a mausoleum or anything, and they want to spread their ashes, which is everybody's choice. But that really, that's another really good reason why you need to give all of that information in tactile form. You know, in the even if it isn't in the paper, if it's at the funeral home, you can get those. You can send that out yourself too. But yes, yes. Well, I've never thought about this before, but I go everywhere in my life by Mary Kay Shanley, which is my birth name. But in 1968, I got married to Dennis Rhodes, and so my driver's license and my passport are Mary Kay Rhodes, and everything else is Mary Kay Shanley. And I never thought about, if I had a headstone, it would be really wide. Continued on other side. Yes? Well, you can't make it up, or you shouldn't make it up. It's just, you know, it's nothing is easy and nothing is sequential and nothing is sure. But I think what we have to do is decide how we want, what we want to say, and how we want to say it at the end, and do the best we can. And it's just, for most of it, I figure for everybody in this room, that's kind of how we've lived our lives. We've done the best. We're doing the best we can. We're doing the best we can. So there still might be error. There still might be omission. But the more that you can pass on that's accurate, the better it is. Yes. I think it's wonderful. Summarizing your life in a short poem. Okay. And then where would this be? I'm just getting ideas, because a lot of what's in here wasn't in here. I just gave this presentation up in Waterloo about 6 weeks ago, and every time I meet with people, I have to change it, because you can't make it longer, but you sure, there's stuff that is so good, like this is so unique. It would be on my gravestone. Okay. I think that, well, I know that you can do whatever you want because it's yours. And they can put your picture on there. Yes. We have one in Webster City. She died when we were 16. She was, I was in the year ahead of her, and she died in a car accident, Patty Morton, and she, they didn't have a headstone then, but because the family was young, but they bought one, and they have a big, it's a Catholic cemetery, and they have a big, like a medallion thing, and you open it up, and her picture is in there. You know, and some people say, oh, that was just weird. No, it was their choice. You know, even back then, it's like, we have these rules. Well, it's your gravestone, it's your daughter. If you want to do that, you can. Yes. It's very expensive to die, so I would suggest that we all live as long as we possibly can. Any questions about how to tackle the writing of an obituary? Yeah, feel comfortable? Yes. That's up. It's all up to you. the obits I think that are most useful to the reader give you the kind of the obituary, the name and the family and stuff, and a little bit about that person and who died of this, and then you go on to talk about the person, because it just makes more sense than if you don't put the cause of death in up at the top. I think the reader might be a little distracted, thinking, well, what did this person die from? What happened? If you're going to be in giving the big picture, as I wish everybody would, that then you can go on and tell some of the story. That's more. First, you tell who the person is, and what the person did, and why who the family was, and where they, all the facts, and then I think you can very easily go into the person, the essence of the person, with some things, maybe some like what I shared with you, but I really like the one that I gave you, the little things about Robin Klein's mother, because it's probably more like what most of us are going to write. Yes. Oh, what a good point. Did you hear that? Okay, yes. To tell the earlier life, which really was the life that she would want us to know about, to remember, to pass on down for you, especially genealogists. I think that's how do you write about your accomplishments, the things that you did that you want people to know about without bragging? You just very factually say so. Because what the people are reading your obituary for is to know what you did. And we are a very modest people. Iowans especially, I think Iowans especially are very, we don't walk around with a sign, I did this today. And, but I think we can say what we did, and it's just the facts. But there's that whole notion, and also that example from Robin Klein's mother's obituary. It was full of facts, little sentences that gave you insight, but it wasn't it wasn't like I accomplished this or that. Did you hear this? Okay, she said, I'll try to get it right, that she read an obituary and it talked about all the things that he did and the things that he valued, and right in the middle of it was that he really enjoyed Fox News. And it's like, okay, that is a statement, And in this day and age, you either want to cut it out and frame it because it makes you happy, or you want to crumble up the paper and throw it away, because we are black and white today, and we got to get beyond that. Yes. Thank you for coming. This is a really curious presentation, because most Humanities Iowa presentations are, we make up our makeup. We design our own presentations, but when they're done, I might always tweak a little bit here and a little bit there for next time. But I've given this maybe 4 or 5 times now, and every time then I go back to my office and I go, oh, wow. And I have to rewrite it because there's new stuff, and I don't really like to leave anything out, but we can't just have the afternoon and then go into the evening. So thank you for coming, and I really enjoyed this. And what a good. Michelle gave me